Welcome to Your College Bound Kid,
a podcast for parents, college counselors, students, and anyone who wants a weekly deep dive into the world of college admissions.
My name is Julia. I was an admission officer at Haverford College, an outside reader for Emory University, and I currently work at Milton Academy, an independent boarding and day school outside of Boston, Massachusetts.
I'm Lisa, and I'm a clinical psychologist and college counselor. I have a daughter in college, a daughter in high school, and a son in middle school. After 30 years in Chicago, we recently moved to North Carolina.
My name is Mark. I'm a college coach in Atlanta and the parent of two daughters. Karis, a graduate of Davidson College, and she is the founder of the Spanish tutoring company, SpanishHelpToday.com. And Joy has a bachelor's degree from the University of Georgia and a master's degree from North Carolina State University. She works in private practice in Raleigh as a mental health therapist. And I'm so blessed to be able to work alongside both my beautiful daughters at School Match for You, a college counseling firm that I founded in 2010. This week in the news, Julia's my co-pilot, and we'll be talking about what should a student do when they submit their application and they realize they made a mistake or they realize they left something out. Do they contact the school? Do they not contact the school? Who do they contact and when do they contact? We'll be talking all things about mistakes in your submitted application. And for a question from a listener, Katie from El Paso, Texas, wants to know how colleges divide the country up into regions. And Julia will be my co-host for that question as well. And we'll have a brand new interview, and it's with Marissa Salizar. She's over all visit programs at Colorado College, and we'll be talking about all things college visits. We'll be talking about everything from the open house visit to the daily visit to the admitted student visit to fly-in programs and to self-guided tours. And we're giving our staff a break through the new year, so there'll be no spotlights, but they'll resume in January. Friends, before Julie and I start talking about what to do if a student makes a mistake on an application, just give you a little bit of a backstory. Our plan was to run a Rick Clark blog article on this podcast, and we actually have recorded it and had it all ready to go. But you know, as the producer, sometimes I have to make a judgment call, just like a quarterback calls an audible, changing the plays. And I just felt that Julia had such amazing content in our admissions tip that I let it run for like 20 minutes. What to do if you make a mistake. And I also thought our admissions vernacular was something you guys were going to be really interested in too. So we let that run another 8 minutes or so on the tip. And so basically I did something I've never done before. We took the admissions tip, admissions vernacular, big number, and it ran it as its own episode because I kind of want it to be around 30 minutes. And we'll pick up next week with part 2, which will be entirely focused on a great article from Rick Clark from his Georgia Tech admissions blog that encourages applicants to think of your application the way colleges think of an application, which is very different from how most students and parents think about their application. But you may want to take notes on what Julia has to say, because I thought her content was just so rich, so deep about what to do if students make a mistake. So, if you're driving or you're doing the dishes or you're jogging, that's all good. That's how I usually listen to podcasts. But every now and then I want to take some notes. And this might be one for taking notes for, because most students make mistakes at some point in their submitted application. And one thing about our 4 co-hosts who participate in the news segment is they've all been an admission officer or an admissions reader at least 2 schools. Vince has been at 6 schools. Everyone also has 10 to 30 plus years experience on the counseling side. So it just gives our co-host really unique insights being on both sides of the desk. Dave's the only exception in the rotation. He gives us a unique diversity as a parent and a dad who's navigated the process as a parent, especially the highly selective admission process. But without any further ado, I want you to hear from Julia so you can imbibe her knowledge and wisdom gleaned from her admissions experience. Friends, I'm coming to you again from Mars Hill, North Carolina, up in the mountains, but I'm joined by Julia today. Hi, Julia.
Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good. So we got an exciting article that we're going to dive into. We're both really excited about this one. But before we do, we're going to start out with our admission tips. And I've asked Julia if she will share what advice she gives when a student comes to her and said, I submitted my application, but I made a mistake. So I just want her to share like who she tells them to go to, when she says, I'll leave that alone versus that one's worth correcting. Just give our listeners some pointers on this tip, please, Julia.
Sure. So, and I'll say this, I think most applications at some point have, there's probably something's a little imperfect in there and whatnot. Even if when I was an admission officer, I'd see typos a lot, but that is usually not an alarming issue or whatnot. So really, it depends on the size of mistake. So maybe you forgot a period in your one of your activities descriptions, or in the supplement, you meant to use a colon instead of a semicolon. Those things I would really just let be. And I know that you might stay up at night thinking about it, but I promise you, I never made an admissions decision based on the placement of a period in a sentence.
I have a question for you, Julia.
Yeah.
I know you got your mojo going, but I don't want to forget. I'm sure you experienced somebody reaching out to you about some of those things on the admission side,
Yes.
And did that feel like a little bit of a nuisance call, or how did you take that when someone said, oh, I think, my punctuation wasn't off. How do I change it? They were emailing you. So how did you receive that on the other end?
Yeah, I think I worked at a small liberal arts college. And so while I was like, oh, that's a little ridiculous, the student's upset about it, it didn't bother me necessarily. However, when I talk to my colleagues at others, especially this day and age where it's just admission officers are really busy, most are underpaid and underappreciated. And then when it comes to larger institutions, and the one I worked at, it could actually kind of bother an office or an admission officer. And in fact, I have had my students call the main admissions number to try to remedy something, and the frontline person is just like, no, I'm not moving your call anywhere. No. And then the student feels defeated, and then they're like, oh no, so the whole thing I think just gets blown out of proportion. So those kind of things I like to leave alone. And the idea is that, if all colleges are different, right? Some are really okay with a student reaching out about anything. Some really don't have the bandwidth, and some are like pretty clear about that they don't want you following up on things. So oftentimes after you've applied somewhere, some colleges will have maybe like a portal application update. So in the portal, maybe you can upload something or let people know. I think sometimes, besides mistakes, the other thing I hear from my students is like, oh, I got an award after I applied. Like, how can I tell the college? And these I sometimes generally discourage as well too, because you really don't want to be overactive or reacting and or over interacting with a college if that's just not their style. So if a college doesn't have a portal update, for example, it probably means they don't really want you reaching out to them or updating them. Now, if your mistake meets two categories for me, like one would be like a pretty massive mistake. So I just talked to Mark about this last year, but I had a student who pressed for time as she's finishing her early applications, neglected to copy and paste about the last whole paragraph, almost half of her Common App essay. And because she was moving really quickly, she didn't really read the preview. And so that to me was worth it for us to reach out to colleges, because she essentially applied without half of her essay, one of the major components. And because she did meet the deadline, we were very lucky in that the colleges did allow her to resubmit her essay through various ways of doing so. And in that case, we could just call the frontline people and they could help us. We didn't need to email the admission rep. We didn't need to wait for an answer. The other sort of category where I think it's worth, and you could always, I would go to your counselor or whatnot. And if you don't have a counselor, try to think, would the integrity and the overall understanding of my app be really hampered if I didn't sort of fix this mistake, rather than just a couple typos here and there? The other category for me is that in the day of post varsity blues, so our most fun experience in admissions world a little while ago. Actually, what I do now as a counselor is my students at many colleges are randomly audited. They're admitted and then randomly audited. And I have to confirm the veracity of and the truthfulness of their application. So if perhaps you put in something that is not entirely truthful by mistake, that is another time that I think it is worth it calling the admission office. I'm actually dealing with this right now with a really lovely student who was up for an award. And so we put in her Common App the name of the award, but then wrote pending eligibility. Unfortunately, she didn't get that award. So now she's like very worried that she misrepresented herself on the app. But because we use the term pending eligibility, I don't think it's worth it for us to call the offices and they'll be like, okay, we get that. And at the end of the day, while the awards are important to the student, I don't think any of the colleges really care if she gets it or not. So it would just sort of look like we're a little over anxious. It would look like we're maybe a little too Hermione Granger here. And so, and not that would maybe make you not admissible, but it wouldn't endear you to the college. So, so if you think that you've made a mistake that really alters the truthfulness of your application, then that might be worth calling the college and remedying. But those are really the only two categories for me. So you've omitted really major something in your application. And be warned, I did have a student who actually did admit, actually it was the same, not the same student, but the same college. I don't know what it's like, the Bermuda Triangle of applications, I guess. But he didn't realize he had made a mistake in his application until the day before the college was going to release decisions. And so the college was not forgiving at all about, because the student had essentially a month and a half to fix that mistake. So it really depends on the college. It depends on the timing. But I would say only if it alters the overall message of your application, or there's something that's not truthful, that's a mistake, then I would say both of those situations might warrant you contacting the college.
So how does a student know where to start in terms of who to contact?
Yeah, I actually think so. When it comes to the applications in this sort of bit, your frontline people are your best bet. I like to call, I stole that name from Cassie Fritz, who's over at Andover in the college counseling department. And so that would be the people that when you call the main admissions line, those are the people that answer. So they're not admission officers usually, but they are people that can process and fix your application or tell you how to do that. You don't necessarily need to go to your reader to do that. So I just always say, you're welcome to email the main admissions email, but I actually like to go to the phone a lot of the time. I find getting a person and being able to fix something right then and there will make you sleep a little bit better at night. And then you can kind of verbalize what it is you're trying to do. Whereas sometimes if you send an email, I know some colleges use bots, and then, or also like you might not be clear in your message, and then it will take more days to get an answer about how to fix your application. Now, this is not true of every college. I'll say if you call, like one of my favorites is University of Connecticut. When you need to do something in your application, you go through student accounts. So you'll be on hold for about 15 minutes while they deal with the other, 50,000 undergraduate students, right? So not every college will be like this, but I usually tell students just most admission offices have a main number. Even Harvard, who doesn't like you contacting them, has a main number that you can call and just say, I'm a first-year student. I think I've made a mistake in my application. I'm just wondering what I can do for next steps, if there are any.
And I thought it was so important. I'm so glad you talked about the difference between schools on this, especially not always correlated with size, but a lot of times it is correlated with size. Sometimes I'd say also correlated with public-private also in terms of the approach. Not always, but often. But how is somebody to know if they're listening to what you said about what constitutes a small school versus a large school. Like, are there any cues for somebody? You have the experience of having worked with these schools and seen how they process and how they respond to different kids in different situations, but a senior doesn't, right? So is there any tips for a senior? Let's say they're at a public school, the guidance counselor doesn't know anything. They've reached out to them and that's been a dead end. They're not working with anybody outside independently or anything. Any tips for how they can know sort of this school may be kind of large, so I might want to tread lightly and let this pass versus this school seems to be small and intimate? Any suggestions?
Yeah, I think sometimes, obviously the size will just, you can even just Google a size of the undergraduate. I would say that, even by and large, like NYU, for example, is 25,000 undergrads, but like I can usually get someone on the phone. Wisconsin, 33,000 undergrads. It might take me a while to get someone on the phone. So you can go by that. But another really good hint is, what does the admission office website look like? Many will say like, connect with us. And when you click on that page, if it's just a form, if there's no one's names listed or no staff, and in fact, they have a stock form and that's the only way you can even connect with them, then you're maybe not going to get a personal, intimate customer service experience when you call. Other places will say like, find your admission counselor. And in that case, and they give the contact information for the admission counselor, that generally means the college might have some bandwidth and interest in you connecting with them, and that it wouldn't be, they put the contact information out there so you can ask questions if you have them. Actually, just recently, I had a student who could not log into their portal at University of Puget Sound, and we did actually go right to our admissions officer who actually went into the database and fixed things on like the IT side for us. And I was like, wow, you are an admission officer of many talents, because I did not know how to do that. But University of Puget Sound is a small
very intimate experience, right? With them. Yeah.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, and in fact, they gave us directions that if you have any problems with your application or your portal, just email directly your admission officer. And that's what we did. So usually kind of the way that the website is laid out, there's also some websites where the admission officer for your area is listed, but there's no contact information, right? It's just the name of the person. So the more information that the admission office gives is probably a good inclination to you about what kind of bandwidth they have and how easy it might be to connect with them.
No, all good. All definitely good insight. So let's talk a little bit about that honors point, because that comes up with me a lot. A lot of times it's not always in the context of I forgot, but it's more in the context of they got an honor or an award since they submitted the application.
Right.
And like, listen, certainly there are schools that invite portal updates on some of those things. But in general, I agree with you, Julia. The student tends to think that this award they got is going to be dispositive and it's going to like make their it's going to flip them into admit. And that's just so seldom the case, isn't it? Do you want to talk about that?
It is. I really struggle with this conversation because,
they're so excited too. You don't want to throw a bucket of water on their zeal.
My students are so excited, and I'm excited for them. And in that immediate world, it feels like a really big deal. And I'm going to say this, and I don't mean that it's not a big deal in your world, but the other thing I try to tell my students is that colleges are looking for students that can think outside of themselves and think outside of a bubble. And if you're so sort of focused on a small award that means something really just in your circle, in your world, it kind of shows that you've got some myopia around you. If you're really hung up on getting an award that really, like any college is like, okay, that's great, but like it doesn't change anything about how we thought about you. And there's very few awards out there that would change the way, like I'm talking about like international, like Forbes 30 under 30. These are not high school competitions. These are not regional distinctions, even national merit. Like, do you think Harvard is like, oh, okay, they're national merit? No, they expect
Of course, most people aren't applying to Harvard, so we have to, I'm going
also
to,
true.
get out of Harvard on that,
Yes.
in terms of that, but still, the point is still well taken.
Yes. And
definitely.
So it is. And so I also tell my students that, if they're going to keep harping on an award, or, even if the college has no way of, for you to update them, and we just need to sit with that. If they felt like there needed to be something else, they would give you that opportunity. But know that too, if you're able to restrain yourself from trying to be like, oh, I need to talk about this sort of, award that's important in my world, but maybe, would not make or break my application, that you can show them that like, oh, I'm self-aware. I realize that this is important in my world, but in the general scheme of things, that this is not something I need to tell you that would change my application. So oftentimes I do get feedback from colleges where students are a little myopic and thinking that this is, like really worthy of making sure someone can get into the application and change something or update something. It doesn't land well sometimes on colleges when a student is going after it.
Yeah, I think there's two really important points there. That I'm really glad that you brought up. One of them is when a school doesn't allow updates, and there are quite a few that don't. That is such a clear message.
Yeah,
they're sending such a clear message, right? Like, why would they not allow updates? Because they get bombarded with them, and they're usually not really, change things. And then the other point that you brought up was when you talked about colleges wanting you to be others focused and not so internally focused.
Yeah.
I have that thought a lot because I'll give an example. Let's say I have a student that says, I made high honor roll, and I want them to know I made high honor roll. You really can run the risk, because I always have this thought, it can come across like grade grubbing a little bit.
Yes.
how for those of you who don't know, there's a term admission officers called a grade grubber, and especially more selective schools, like grades are extremely important to them, but they want to know that you got your grades mostly out of your love for learning drove you to dive into the material, and you're responsible, person. And so therefore the outcome of you having a love of learning and being responsible is that you got good grades, as opposed to you wanted valedictorian on your resume, or you want the recognition at the award ceremony. And I realize that's a little bit in some ways probably unfair, because humans are motivated by recognition. But selective colleges do differentiate between the person they felt that got their grades because of more recognition, and they would see that as more outwardly than love of learning and that kind of thing, right? So that's what we talk about grade grubber. Like, it's the person that has to go to great lengths to try to get the teacher to change the grades and all that sort of thing. So I have that thought when I have some students sometimes who want to approach me about changing. I want them to know about this. I'm like, this is feeling a little grade grubby. It could come off from, but I totally get it from their perspective. They want to get in, they want it badly. And doesn't looking better help your chances of getting in? Why would I not want to look better?
Right.
So it's a completely human thing. And also in their world, that whatever that thing is, it means a lot to them. I mean, they might have worked really, really hard for that.
Yes.
Or it might have been something they didn't think they were going to get, and they're so surprised and proud. And all of those are completely understandable and human. It's just that in the big scheme of things, I'm really glad you mentioned it. Most of the time, an individual award here or there is not going to be dispositive. It's not going to move the needle. It's not going to be the thing that caused you to get admitted.
Right. Yep. And I also hope parents are listening to this as they do, because I actually mostly struggle with parents calling me, telling me their child just got this award or that award, and how will they update the colleges. So also we can partner with each other here, parents and students, and that I know your kid hung the moon. They did. But we need to be sure that we're sort of reporting to colleges in a way that doesn't, come off as disingenuous or doesn't, it's not in the spirit of being self-aware.
Thank you for that. All right. Great conversation. And I let it run long because I thought it was really something that would be of interest to our listeners. So for our admissions vernacular, I'm assuming you've probably come across this word in your day, Julia. Tip. Do you ever hear that term used, a tip?
Like to
in
tip
admissions?
in? Or
Yes. Why don't you tell our listeners what that is?
If I'm thinking what you're thinking, sort of like if someone gets tipped into the class in admission review.
Well, I've actually heard it used two ways. I've heard it used that way, tipped into the class, and then I've also heard it tip almost like a synonym for like a hook.
Oh, yes. Yeah, exactly. What it is that tipped them in. Yes.
Yeah. So it's kind of similar. It's probably more like noun, verb, or different forms of the word or whatever. But why don't you tell our listeners like an example of these kinds of what we're talking about here in case this is completely going over someone's head?
Sure. So I think a lot of admission committees kind of run like this. So you're reading applications at a college, right? And then there's many applications that would be admissible, right? So, but there's usually not enough space at any of these places where you can admit all admissible folks. So that's when often colleges will go to something called committee, right? Where a bunch of them are in a room discussing the admissible applicants. And there's got to usually be something that tips them into the class, right? So they might be up for admission, but what it is that's going to get them in is what tips them in, because it really sometimes is so small that to me it's like a exact sort of visual. It's just like the little bloop, a little tip that gets them, that drops them right into the admit pool. It's usually not an overwhelming amount of evidence because they're already there to be admitted. So there might be a couple factors or one factor that kind of tips them into the class or tips them into the
give a couple
list.
or tips. Yeah, correct. So give a couple examples to people so they could see maybe if this is totally foreign to them.
Sure. So I think hooks obviously is a big part of that. So, when they're looking at all the admissible applicants and then they're looking at their institutional priorities. So maybe they need more men, maybe they need more people from South Dakota, that might be what tipped somebody into the class. So they were admissible. Their friend that went to the same high school was also admissible, but they had something that tipped them into the class. Or I often use this phrase when I'm talking to my students about the importance of supplemental essays, which we talk about ad nauseum, right? And that it is often the supplement that tips a student into the admit or the waitlist maybe pile for my students. So that it is the factor they're there and they're admissible, their foot is in the door, but what is it that pushes them in through?
And it literally could be 100 different things, right?
Yeah.
It really, like could get, someone could speak up and say, we really are not doing well with boys from Ohio this year. And then someone else could speak up and say, I'm looking at data. We haven't taken somebody from this school in 7 years. Friends, when I was editing this podcast, it dawned on me. Someone may think, snap, they haven't taken someone from 7 years? Whoopee-doo. Now, I just showed my age with that line from the 70s. Who says that anymore, right? Why in the world would that be a tip? So I thought you may be interested in how both college counselors think and how admission officers think. From a college counseling standpoint, if you consistently feel you're sending great students to a school and they keep denying or waitlisting them, eventually you're going to say, I don't know who this school will take. And you're going to become discouraged or disheartened. You're going to stop sending that student to that school. I mean, last year I was so disappointed by a student that Princeton never took that I had to stop myself from having those thoughts to myself. But should that happen 5 years in a row, I might subtly steer students interested in Princeton to some other similar institutions. We've had more of a success. Now, in fairness to Princeton, they took a kid 2 years in a row I wasn't sure if they were going to take. One actually surprised me quite a bit. So it's not a diss on Princeton. Hopefully you get the point. I'm just trying to let you know how you think as a counselor. Now, from an admission recruitment standpoint, your mindset is if we want to continue to get the best applicants from School X, we can't keep rejecting them or keep waitlisting their students. The counselor's going to stop prioritizing us. There's also no buzz in the school, no buzz in the parent body, no buzz in the student body, no one wearing the t-shirt, getting our name up there, spreading the enthusiasm that can be contagious. I was director of the recruitment for 7 years when I did boarding school admissions, and keeping our feeder school counselors happy and keeping our name recognition alive in the school was a high priority for me. In college admissions, it works the exact same way. So this is why not having taken a kid from a school, especially if you deem it to be a priority for 7 years, is just one of the dozens and dozens of things that could tip somebody in. Like all those things could be things that could be like, oh, okay. You know what I mean? And those are just a couple just popped in my head when you were talking. But literally, like we could be here forever just mentioning all of the different things. So anyway, we try to get into how the sausage is made because I think from our feedback, you guys find that somewhat interesting. So hopefully this fits in that category. All right. So our big number, I actually have two numbers, and I'm drawing from College Kickstart, of which, we're members and subscribers, but they run some really good data. And so they ran an article recently on the places where early action gives you an advantage, not ED. And I pulled out the SCEA, which stands for Single Choice Early Action, because that's a different kind of early action. There's only 5 schools in that category. And with Single Choice Early Action, if you've heard our podcast we did on that about a half a year ago, you're not allowed to apply to any other private early action schools, but not counting those schools. So there were 2 schools that there was almost double an admit rate, early action to regular, one private, one public. So the private was College of Wooster in Ohio that had a 78% early action admit rate and a 40% regular admit rate. So almost double, right? Going from, and I just thought about this afterward. I thought, I really should have run this before the early action deadlines here, but I got to find the knowledge when I find the knowledge. So we know we don't only have seniors, we have sophomores, we have 7th grader parents, we have 9th graders. So this will help.
Remember that.
This knowledge is going to be more helpful for non-12th graders. And then the X is SUNY Binghamton. So what would you guess would be their admit rates, Julia? Early versus regular.
At College of Worcester and SUNY?
SUNY Binghamton. So Worcester was 78-40.
Okay.
Right? And I'm telling you, SUNY also had a huge advantage early action versus regular. What would you think?
Well, like maybe 60% admit rate in early action?
You are so on it. I knew you know your game. So 59.
Oh, wow.
59 early and 30 regular.
Oh my gosh,
basically
30.
Almost, yes, 30.
Whoa.
Yes.
I am very glad I quite literally forced my New York students to apply to Binghamton early.
Now you have data to come with next year.
Yes. I'm going to pretend I knew the whole time.
Awesome. So there we go. Well, we took almost a half an hour on that. I'll probably run it as its own segment. Friends, this concludes the first part of Julia and I initially discussing what to do if you make a mistake. But next week, we will pick up this conversation with a great blog article Rick Clark wrote on his Georgia Tech admissions blog on the importance of thinking about your application the way a college admission officer thinks about it, not the way most students and parents think about it. I hope you'll join us for that next week.
And now it's time for a question from one of our listeners.
Julia, we've got a great question from Katie from El Paso, Texas. I'm going to play the question and then I'm going to let you chime in.
Hi, Mark and everyone at the pod. This is Katie from Texas. I am an avid new listener and want to say thank you so much for being such a great resource for all of us listening out here. My questions are about the geographic regions. Can you explain what and where they are from the admissions office perspective? Does each college define their own regions? How important is it to the colleges to admit kids from all of the regions? In other words, can your region work for or against you if it is under or over represented in the applicant pool? And last, take a place like El Paso, Texas, for example. As a far West Texas border town, would we be included in the Texas region, or would we be considered part of the Southwest region that includes New Mexico and Arizona? Thanks again for the podcast. You guys are helping a lot of people.
All right. What's your advice for Katie?
Yeah, that's a great question. And yes, colleges might call them different things. When I worked at Haverford, we called the regions geomarkets. And so often the way colleges will work in the admission office is that in order to sort of streamline the recruitment process for applicants and then the reading of applications is that admission officers are assigned certain regions or geographic regions of the country of where they're going to be reading applications from. And that can really change depending on the college, how they work with that. They might have areas that are overrepresented for them that aren't for other places. By and large, I think New Jersey is always overrepresented for every college.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? How many people applied from New Jersey, especially the East Coast schools?
Right, exactly. And good on you, New Jersey. You have an excellent education system then. You got so many students looking at colleges. So it really can depend. And it also can inform regions can be a part. Katie, you're correct about sort of the admission criteria. So there are many places that could be underrepresented. Sometimes a state might be overrepresented, but not an area of a state. I use my example all the time. Massachusetts obviously has a ton of colleges. A lot of students applying to four-year colleges. I grew up in a rural area of Massachusetts that doesn't have a lot of students leaving or going to four-year colleges or two-year colleges. So even though I was applying from Massachusetts, which is an overrepresented state, to the Northeastern college I did attend, I was applying from an area that does not see a lot of applications. So it really can depend on the school and sort of what they're looking for. So by and large, if the college you're applying to is in a 100-mile radius, your region is probably overrepresented, right? Because even if it's a school people haven't heard of, I'm going to use Haverford for an example. I think if you're into selective college admissions, you've probably heard of Haverford. If I'm going to go to the grocery store and pull 10 people, I might not get anyone that's ever heard of Haverford College. Now, a lot of people in the state of Pennsylvania had heard of Haverford because it's in their state. So we would get some applicants from students that had just heard of us and so had applied. However, when I worked at Emory, it would be kind of a big deal to get someone from Chester, Pennsylvania, or Jenkintown, Pennsylvania, because those were far enough outside of
me back to my names here.
Far enough outside of sort of the Philadelphia area that it was sort of it was underrepresented. So it can really depend. And Katie had a specific question about being from El Paso, and I think in that the college, I don't know how it might code you. You can always ask, but they usually try to group geomarkets by sort of aligned time zones, cultures, politics, things like that. The Southwest is covers a lot of area simply because there's just not a huge population. Not that it's just let's like take that quadrant and put it into one. It's just that there's not a lot of students in that area. Now, El Paso is a really good example because oftentimes, while it's not overrepresented at selective schools, you can usually bank on an admission officer recruiting from Dallas, Austin, certainly Houston, but San Antonio is sometimes, El Paso especially, because El Paso being such a border town that we would get we would get dreamers, we would get students who had like rich cultural experiences. There's also a really great Jewish population in El Paso, and we would get students from a particular school there who are looking to go to school in the Northeast where there's maybe a higher Jewish population. So El Paso has all its nuances. So that's why colleges do try to group into regions or geo markets, is so that way the admission officer in charge of that space has a real understanding of the area and what the high schools are like and what the culture is like. Being from New York City and going to a private school is very different than being from New York City and going to a public school, right? So even sometimes in regions, the schools are different within the region. So you might have an admission officer that just reads private schools from the same area and a different admission officer who reads public schools from the same area. So the regions are really set by the college and what their priorities are, and also sort of the bandwidth, maybe the amount of applications they get from each area.
Yeah, that was a very comprehensive answer. I really don't have a lot to add, but I just, if you think about it from an admission standpoint, officer standpoint, most schools, there are some exceptions that don't read by territory, but most do. So the way most offices work, the way Julia worked when she did, the way I worked when I did it, we divided the whole world, not just even the U.S., the whole world up into regions. You assign different admission officers. So you're going to be sensitive to how much work you're giving each admission officer. So you're going to have a lot of history and data in terms of how many applications generally come out of this region. Also, depending on how much of a commitment the school has to travel, they might take travel logistics into consideration in terms of how territories are divided. Like Julia also said, similarities. That's why the New York private, New York public oftentimes is a different rep that reads those for a city like New York. And as far as, is El Paso always going to be categorized the same from school to school? No, it could literally be in different regions depending on how schools divide regions. In fact, I was talking to a school in the Midwest, and they changed sort of how they divided their regions, because you have some of those states that could go either way. And they made a shift on it, and some of that has to do with the volume of applications or identifying, like Julia said, more similarities between certain regions and other regions. And so, but one thing that's generally going to be true for a couple of things are generally going to be true. What Julia said is you're going to get more applications from your backyard. You can almost just take that to the bank. Still, the majority of students in college go to school within an hour of their home. The majority do. An hour to 90 minutes. So the closer a school is to El Paso, it's a Texas school, they may have a lot more clearly defined delineations within Texas. Whereas if it's a school that's not getting that many applications, this is the other thing that's true. Like, colleges want what they don't have, right? And so if you're not getting that many applications from an area, depending on the school, it could be a huge swath of the country. I remember I was meeting with a rep from SLU, St. Louis University. I couldn't believe how big his geographic territory was, because it was like going from like the Northeast down to the Southeast, because they get a decent number of applications there. I feel it's growing as that school people are starting to catch on to that area and that region. But still, it's a Midwest school, and it's overwhelmingly getting most of its applications from the Midwest. And so you'll find that, right? So that's why it can really, really depend on each school. How many applications are they getting from Texas? How many are they getting from El Paso? The more they're getting, the more they're going to have clear lines within Texas. That's why almost any school you'll see this. A lot of schools will have multiple reps for an area right around them. Instead of going by state, they might go by county or something, right, county. Julia?
Or town. Yep. All the time.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's also about managing a workflow. Like there's only so much work when somebody can do. So now I guess we should ask this. What do we think is important for Katie to know that could impact her student about this? I mean, there's the intellectual curiosity side of I wonder how it works. Is there anything that you would say would be important for her to know?
Yeah, and I think Katie hinted at this, and you're totally, your gut feeling is correct here, is that depending on the area you're coming from and the college you're applying to, yes, your region could complicate or help your chances of admission. And so that's good to know about that. And in fact, that is also something I am always really clear with my students on. Just to remind our listeners, I am at a private school right outside of Boston. We are overrepresented in the hundreds of wonderful New England schools, right? Middlebury, University of Pennsylvania, even GW, George Washington, they get our students in droves. They are overrepresented because they go to, they're in a college going area that has a very high rate of students going to four-year colleges. So oftentimes my students will literally just not be, they're competitive, but they won't be admitted simply because they're just applying from New England. And it's overrepresented. So I do think it's helpful to know. So that way, when you're sort of scratching your head about, oh, I wonder what went wrong. Nothing went wrong. It's just institutional priorities when it comes to regions and whatnot. And I think it's important for people. This is almost like affirmative action with race. Some people misunderstand then, like, oh, I guess I'll just move to South Dakota and I can get in to Columbia. No. It's not just simply, oh, we have a South Dakota applicant, we'll take them.
Sure.
It really is about sort of making sure you balance the class out. So it is important to know that perhaps your geographic region might complicate. It might be neutral. It might complicate. It might help your chances of admission.
You know, I want to make a comment, slightly going off tangent, but I think it'd be of interest to our listeners. So one of the trickiest things for me to communicate, Julia, is colleges don't have quotas for individual high schools. Like they might one year take 8, next year take none. But at the same time, they don't want to take too many kids from one school because they won't see that as diversity. Like you have other feeders. You want to keep your other feeders happy. You know, like you don't want to keep denying every kid from all your other feeders because that pipeline can dry up on you. And the counselors can be like, well, I'm not, they're not taking anybody. So why should I keep sending them kids? Or people get discouraged. Friends, it isn't just about keeping counselors referring you. I mentioned that earlier in the episode. But also different schools can give you exposure to a different culture. And you can get some perspective diversity. Katie asked, how important is it to admit colleges from all the regions? Well, for some regional public schools and even some flagship schools, their mission is to be focused on recruiting their state. So their geo-focus is going to be on getting to all corners of their state. Another flagship might have a different mission. They might want the tuition revenue that comes from getting almost triple the out-of-state tuition. So this can vary from school to school, but public schools get state taxpayer dollars, and that's primarily who they serve. So many times it's different there. But for most private schools, what Julia's office referred to, when Julia worked at Harvard, they referred to as geo markets. When I was in admissions, we just called it geodiversity. And geodiversity is a high priority. Geo being short for geographic, GEO. I'm going to go off on a tangent here, but a lot of white students really struggle with the question they get on the Common App about how will you add diversity to the class. And, we probably need to do a deep dive on this question at some point. But the biggest reason, in my opinion, why people struggle with this is because there can be a tendency to associate diversity with race or with ethnicity. But from a college's standpoint, diversity means differences. So that certainly includes race and ethnicity. And I would be naive to not say that's often the first thing that pops in someone's mind. But it's so much more than that. It includes socioeconomics. It includes both sides of that spectrum, from full pay to somebody that can give you a big donation to the other side of the spectrum. Zero EFC, or Student Aid Index to use the new language. Full Pell Grant recipients. And the group in the middle. You want it all represented. It includes gender. It can include college majors. It certainly includes experiences and perspective diversity and religious diversity and cultural diversity, sexual orientation and globalism and international perspectives. It also includes things like introverts and extroverts. And it certainly includes the geodiversity, or geomarkets, as Julia said they used at Haverford. What colleges do not want to be is a homogeneous echo chamber. It's pretty much the universal belief amongst educators that students learn best when they are exposed to different type of people who think different, who see the world different. Think about this. You take a full-time load at school. That's 15 credit hours. That's 15 hours a week you're in class. Out of 168 hours in a week, do you know that's less than 9% of the time in your day you're in class? So much learning happens student to student in the dorm rooms, in the dining halls. And it happens best when students are exposed to people who think differently than they think. I thought Dr. Andrea Brenner did an outstanding job in her interview with Lisa, explaining how colleges are usually a lot more diverse than the environment most students come from in high school, and parents would be well served to prepare their kids for the diversity they are likely to experience in the college dorm. But yes, to answer the question by Katie, geodiversity or geomarkets are an important component to colleges in recruitment. And so there is an aspect in which everybody's different, but there's also an aspect in which, oh, it's another Milton kid. And yep. There can be an aspect where it can be harder to get into from a school where they get so many applicants, because the school can feel like, I can be pretty picky here. We have 65 applications from the same school, you know? Mm-hmm. And so it's there's not a quota, but there can be an aspect when you're in a more competitive pool. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. So now, do you have conversations with your students? I'm sure you do. Like, why don't you look at some of these schools? Like, they don't see as many Milton applicants over here. And a lot of times that's going to be other regions of the country. There's not going to be very many schools that go undiscovered between Northern Virginia and New England for you, and probably all the way down even to certainly North Carolina as well. But for you, probably it's sometimes the Southeast, Southwest, Midwest.
Yeah, pretty rarely.
The thing is, most of your students are looking at most selective schools too, and it's hard for them to find hidden jewels there. You have to find schools that you know are great, but maybe they have a little softer admit rates, like the College of Worcester.
Yep.
Or the Puget Sounds.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, awesome. Well, this is a great question, Katie. We really appreciate you sending it in. Thank you so much for listening to your college-bound kid. And the other day, we discovered some more of Elliot Felix's book, How to Be Successful in College. So I thought we were out of those books. And Nature's like, there's 12 more over here. So we still got some more of those books, and you'll be getting one out in the mail. But it's going to be about 10 days because I'm on this extended trip here where I'm in North Carolina for a good 10 days. And when we get back, we'll get those books out to you. But thank you guys for sending in your questions. And we can send some more questions in. We now have 5 minutes if you're a chatterbox like me and you want to give an extended question. You don't need to use all 5, but sometimes in the past, people got cut off after 90 seconds because we were on the free plan, but we upgraded to the subscription plan. So send your questions in just to speakpipe.com/YCBK. Thanks, Katie. Friends, you're getting a second SpeakPipe question today. This time I'm solo, but it's really short.
Mark, I'm listening to the podcast with Chris, the fellow about AI, and you said he emailed you a list of all his books, and you'd see the email in the show notes. It's not there. I went to the website. It's not there. So where is it? Can you post it somewhere in the show notes or in the website? Don't tell listeners it's there if it's not. It's very frustrating.
So, friends, I have several thoughts on this question / statement, and I'll be short, but I'll cover it. We pride ourselves in authenticity. So I have to admit, I first was taken a little back. First thought I had when I heard it was, Jay, we're working really, really hard here to deliver you guys 3 hours of free content. Haven't you heard the sandwich concept? Start out positive, and if you have something constructive to say it, and then end positive, or that you catch more flies with honey than vinegar. So that was my first initial reaction. But then I caught myself and I thought about several other things. My dad liked to quote scripture, and one of his favorite verses in the Bible is in the book of Proverbs. It says, pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. So I thought, Mark, don't be so full of pride that you can't miss the message. Then I thought of another axiom that I was taught probably 30 years ago that I really value, which simply says, let your critics be your unpaid counselors. In other words, people pay big bucks for consultants to learn how they can do better. If you'll just listen to your criticism, then you can improve. So then I had that reaction. So those are all the thoughts that went through my mind. But let me just respond really quickly to the person who never, and I'm just calling them the person, I'm not trying to be impersonal. They never gave their name, they never gave their city, and they didn't even leave an email. I was going to follow up with them directly. So I'm not really sure what to refer to them, but the person who sent this in. So we did put up show notes for the interview that I had with Chris. We did have show notes during to the interview on AI with Chris Chilbert, and they're actually still up. So we ran them 5 straight weeks, and I'm going to continue to keep them there at least through Christmas. I think there could be a couple of problems as to why you're not getting the show notes. One reason could be that you are using an app that doesn't either have show notes in the app or doesn't have them as long as ours are. I don't know. Another possibility, which I think is probably more likely, is, and maybe this is something that we need to think about, and this listener may be helping us to improve with this feedback. So what happens is, my mindset a lot of times, particularly with interviews, is Monday interviews are in the Monday lane. All right. So Monday interviews always go on even numbers and Thursday episodes go on odd numbers. So Chris Chilbert's interview was a Monday episode. So those show notes appeared they're still there. They've been there for 4 or 5 Mondays in a row. And like I said, we'll continue there. But they were not in the Wednesday show notes. So I think that's most likely the situation, that you probably went to a Wednesday episode looking for show notes that were in the Monday episodes. But if you go back, you'll look, they're there for the last 4 to 5 weeks. You should be able to find them there. And another thing too, I thought, Mark, don't be so thin-skinned, because you do say at the end of every episode, use SpeakPipe for a number of things. Use it if you have an article you think we should read. Use it if you have a recommended resource that you think we should recommend. Use it if you have a question. Use it if you have some positive feedback that you want to give to one of our co-hosts, or just positive feedback in general. And we also say use it if you have some constructive criticism. So if you're going to ask for that, then, this is just my self-talk. Don't be so thin-skinned. So anyway, that's my answer to that question. Hopefully it was helpful.
And now this week's interview with a special guest.
Friends, I really want to thank Hillary Dickman for recommending Marissa Salizar to me for this interview. I really loved this interview. I enjoyed it even more when I edited it. If you're a regular listener of Your College Bound Kid, there's 2 things we're committed to. We're committed to doing deep dives on topics, and we're committed to, as the kids say, keeping it real, or keeping it 100. being authentic. And I feel that's what happens in this interview as we tackle a subject in depth that we really haven't tackled in our 383 episodes. And that is we do a deep dive on all things college visits. It's a 5-part series, and you wonder, how do we determine how many parts it is? We basically like to have about 20 minutes a segment. So I see how long the total interview is divided by 20, and that tells me how many segments. But we're going to talk all things open house. We're going to talk all things admitted student visits. We're going to talk about overnight programs. We're going to talk about self-guided tours. And we're going to talk about fly-in programs. No, not necessarily in that order, but we're going to cover all of that. And so in part 1 of my interview with Marissa gives her backstory and the various roles that she's had. She describes how the open house differs from other college visits. Marissa describes who open house is best designed for. Marissa explains some different models that different schools use for their open house. And Marissa discusses how open houses relate to yield. Listen and enjoy. Friends, you're in for a real treat today. We're here with our first-time guest, Marissa Salizar from Colorado College. Hello, Marissa.
Hi, everyone.
Well, I'll give you a little background. So our regular listeners know we have a Colorado College admissions rep on at least once a quarter, whether it's in the interview part or in the news section. And Hillary is a regular, so she never misses a podcast. And so she reached out and she's like, Mark, I don't think I've ever heard a podcast on open houses. And we'd actually been talking about it internally. And she said, I think I have the perfect person for you. So with that in mind, Marissa, why don't you share your backstory, how you got into admissions, different roles you have, what you're doing now?
Yeah. Well, thanks, Mark. It's an honor to be here. I'm excited to chat today about some open houses and daily visits. But for those of you who don't know me, I'm Marissa Salizar. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm one of the associate directors of admission at Colorado College. I'm going into my 7th year at CC, but I've been in higher ed for about 9. I am originally from Orlando, Florida. Shout out to the 407. I was born and raised there. I graduated from the University of South Florida. I grew up in a single family household, first generation student. So when I went into college, I was like every other student, and I was pre-med when I first got in. And after I took my first math class, that drastically changed. I was like, so communications doesn't seem so bad. Maybe I'll go into that. And so, was ebbing and flowing through different majors, and ended up getting a health science degree in criminal justice. And now here I am, working at admission, and super thankful to have worked in admission.
So wait a minute there, Marissa. How did you get from health sciences to admission? I feel like we're skipping a couple chapters.
I know. So I want to say it was like the end of my first year, and there was a job posting in the admission office for the call center, and applied for it, got it, and just fell in love.
Was this CC or somewhere else?
This was at the University of South Florida.
Okay, USF, right where you graduated from.
Where I did my undergrad.
Yeah.
So did that for 3 years and just loved chatting with families, got to shadow some recruitment events, and just really loved my time. And then, of course, graduated and was like, what do I do now? Where am I going? The health field didn't make a lot of sense for me after doing an internship in public health. So I went home. My father got sick. So I was actually home with him, taking care of him, and came across a job opportunity at the University of Central Florida, so the rival school of USF, and was like, am I really going to do this?
Can I do it? Will they disown
can I do
me?
Is that allowed?
Yeah.
Exactly. So, applied for it, and, shout out to Chris Dahlstrom, took a chance on me, and I've really loved the profession ever since. And so came in as a entry-level admission counselor, really sort of in-house information sessions, talking with students and families as they came into the office. And then after about a year was promoted to assistant director. And that's when I started the recruitment piece of my admission journey. The year after that, in 2017, met Carlos Jimenez, who was the director at Colorado College at the time, at a conference. And he was like, you should apply for a job opening that's coming up soon. And I was like, okay. So I did that, came out to the campus, absolutely loved it. And It was a huge shift, right? Like going from a large public institution with over 70,000 students to little old CC and the block plan. And I think what drew me most to this place was the holistic review, right? Like I actually got to know my students, you know, the community at CC. We like to lean on the block plan as, we're super different. And I do think that there's some truth to that. So that really is what keeps me around, is the students and the community here at CC.
Cool. So do you have certain territories? Talk to us about like what your roles, because you've been there 7 years. So I know you've probably done a few things. Talk to us about what you've done in your 7 years at CC.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Okay. So came in as an assistant director. It's just more of a generalized role. My primary markets have always been the South because I am from Florida. So they're like, Florida transcripts are hard to read and you're from there. Like, let's just put you there. I was like, okay, perfect. So have primarily recruited there. As I've, worked in the office, I've been a part of the outreach and access team. So working with underrepresented students, helped with the fly-in program, which we can certainly talk about on this if you would like. Just running that event. I've switched to athletics for a little bit and worked with our D3 sports here, and just sort of being that liaison between our office and athletics, and what that process looks like and relationship. What else have I done? I've also kind of helped out in data. Slate.
wow.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. It's a growing market. I think pretty much every college now is operating on Slate. And so that was an interest for me. And I think the best part about being at an institution like CC is that ability to try out different teams. And if you have an interest, there is that flexibility to just sit in and listen and learn. So even though I wasn't actively writing queries or building events, like I was given the privilege to sit in and learn some of that information. During COVID, I had a total, like, what am I going to do with the rest of my life moment, just like everybody else. And I actually left the college for a year, and I worked at Claremont McKenna. So I moved out to California.
Did you meet somebody there at a conference and do your networking thing again?
No. Actually, my supervisor at Colorado College at the time was friends with the director over there and thought that the position would be a good fit. It was working in the outreach and access realm. But COVID was tough, man. And, LA wasn't the best fit for me. I loved my team and I loved my time there. I got to work with the anti-racist steering committee while I was there, doing really incredible work with mentorship programs, establishing a bridge program at the college, and then came back to Colorado for a visit. And my partner was out here at the time and just thought, I think it might make sense for me to come back. I'm a little homesick. And so chatted with our dean here and just kind of gave her some insight into what I was feeling. And that's how I ended up in my position now as the associate director for visitation and operations. I had dabbled in events throughout my 9 years in higher ed, but this primarily is focused strictly on events and operations. So I still have a recruitment territory as well. I've had Connecticut as a state. I've had, all the Midwest, but now I'm back where I rightfully belong in the South. And I also have Europe as well. So I've got some international experience and just love working with those students as well.
Awesome. That was great. That was really thorough. I think our listeners have a good sense of your background. So we're going to talk today about visits and how students can maximize the visit. We'll focus primarily on 3 visits: open houses, the daily visit, and admitted student visit programs. But like you said, we can talk about fly-ins as well. So, but let's first not assume anything. Why don't you tell our listeners what an open house is and how it differs from other visits?
Sure. When I think of an open house, and this is for my foodies out there, think of it like a buffet, right? Where you're coming to campus and you get the opportunity to sample a lot of different items from the college. Versus a traditional daily visit where you might just have an information session to get generalized information and then a campus tour to see different components of the campus. The open house has a few additional qualities that might help depending on where you're at in your search. So for us, for example, we have an essay writing workshop. We have a tips on applying workshop to help shepherd students in their process and meeting kids where they're at. We also have, specialized tours if you're interested in STEM, if you're interested in journalism, right, or the arts or theater. You just get more, as I like to say, like bang for your buck at an open house, just because it is still just a day, but you get a deep dive into what the college might offer.
So when you say a day, is it a full day? Is it a half day? How long is the program? And also, what grade are you targeting? Like, what would be the age that would be appropriate for, to attend the open house?
Yeah, I think generally the open house would run anywhere from 8 o'clock in the morning till about 2 or 3 in the afternoon. Some do a full day from 8 to 5. Those are more of like your larger public institutions that have a lot more option to show, have more support staff to, provide those resources. I think target audience quite depends, right? So for like a fall open house, which generally happens in September and October, we will open that up to rising juniors and seniors. For us, the reason for that is just because of our resources, right? If we couldn't open it up and support 5, 6, 700 students at a time. So we want to be very intentional that the information that we're providing is relevant to our current audience. When I talked about the essay writing and the tips on applying a first year student, I love that they're thinking about that, but probably isn't going to be as relevant in their high school career. And we also support transfers as well, no matter where they're at in the process. If it's their first semester or they're 2 years in, they're also welcome to attend those events as well. I should also mention that some institutions provide specialized programming for transfer students, just because it is such a different process for a lot of institutions when applying. So that's something to keep in mind for any transfers that are listening. They do have specialized programs for you all.
Let's take a break to learn about Mark's recommended resource for the week.
Friends, the recommended resource for episode 383 is something I'm very excited about. It is known as the academic market. We've had these other tuition compacts, these educational compacts, tuition savings programs for the Midwest and for the Northeast and for the West Coast that we featured. I've done two. Linda has done two. This is the Southern Regional Educational Board's program. And I have worked with many students that have done this program, like not 50, but like more than 20. And so what is it? Well, it's a tuition savings program for college students in 15 different states, all states that are part of the Southern Regional Educational Board, who want to pursue degrees that are not offered, this is key, by public institutions in their home state. So, for example, Georgia never used to have any school that had a music business major. So if I had someone that wanted to do music business, they would just go to MTSU, which is Middle Tennessee State, and they could go to MTSU at the in-state Tennessee rate rather than the out-of-state Georgia rate. That's just one of many examples. I said used to because they added a program last year, and therefore it became ineligible for Academic Common Market. But that's basically how it works. Now, because we didn't have a spotlight and today, I'm going to go a little deeper and take a little longer here than I normally would on a recommended resource because, you want to know a great way to save money. One of my daughter's former roommates transferred in from LSU, saved $87,000 through Academic Common Market. Students can enroll in out-of-state institutions and pay the in-state tuition rate, and more than 2,200 undergraduate and graduate programs, more than 100 colleges participate. So not every single school participates. Each school decides if they're going to participate or not, as well as which programs they want to make available. It's also known as the ACM for short. The ACM is not a merit-based program. That's important to know. Students will have to meet the state's residency and the regular college admissions requirements, but it's not similar to other merit-based programs, which there are programs out there that if you receive a certain merit-based standard or level, you can get in-state tuition. That's a very prominent and popular program at certain schools. That's not what this is, though. ACM, what it does is it reduces the unnecessary duplication of academic programs in states in the same region. So I have a whole bunch of schools have a bunch of niche majors when there may not be enough demand for it at a particular school, but there is for the region. And it doesn't punish a student who's a resident of a state that doesn't offer a program by making them have to go out of state and pay the out of state rate. So it's a great idea. It's a win-win for everybody all along. It's important to know that several things about the ACM. No doctoral programs are applicable. Masters and bachelors are. Now, what states participate? I'm just going to read these to you alphabetically. Alabama, Arkansas, Delaware, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maryland, Mississippi, Oklahoma, South Carolina, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. Now, I know what some of you are saying. I never heard North Carolina. They do not participate. They used to, but they dropped out in 2011. I never heard Texas or Florida. Aren't they in the Southeast? Yes. Do they participate? Yes and no. Stuck, you're confusing me. They only participate for graduate students. They are not part of the tuition exchange program for undergraduate, for Florida and Texas. And North Carolina doesn't do it for undergrad or grad. Okay, so how do you qualify? Well, you have to be a resident of one of the 15 participating states that I just mentioned. You have to select a program that's approved for academic common market by the home state, and you have to be unconditionally admitted into the program and meet the state residency and college admissions requirements. So that's really important for you to understand that. Now, if you live in one of these 15 states, you begin by searching for programs available to residents of your state, and you apply to the institution offering your desired program. And then once you're admitted, this is really important, you have to contact your state's ACM coordinator, and they'll take you through the registration process. So one of the, questions people often have is, well, how do they know? What's the certification process? They are going to require certain documents. Those documents vary from state, but basically they involve proving your residency. So very common ones are driver's license, state tax returns, voter registrations. Those are probably the three most common. One other question that people often have is, what are the deadlines? Well, each, state establishes their own deadlines for the application. And another question people often have is, how long does it take? Normally 1 to 2 months for an existing student in an existing program, and 2 to 3 months if it is a brand new program. And another really common question that people ask, and I'm sure this is probably percolating in your mind, is simply this: what if I change my major? So what happens with that is most ACM institutions will not require you to pay back the tuition for the years that you got the ACM benefits if you change your major. It can vary by state, though, so you want to check out each state's policy. If you change your major in the middle of the semester, you may get charged the out-of-state tuition rate for that semester. If you change your major into a different program that is included in ACM, you have to go through recertification by your state coordinator. So those are kind of the basics, for you to know. So hopefully this was helpful. It's a way to save a whole boatload of money. And it's a pretty big region. It goes from Delaware all the way to Texas. But once again, Florida and Texas are only graduate school level. And North Carolina, I'm not sure the history of that, but as part of their General Assembly North Carolina Appropriations Act in 2011, they no longer participated. So there you go, academic common market. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And now turn to my interview with Marissa Salizar. So is the student sort of picking almost like a mini one-day conference where like, I'll go to this session, I'll go to that? Or is it kind of a one-size-fits-all and everybody does the exact same program?
That's such a great question. And this is going to be a theme with me. It depends.
You and every other admission officer.
Yes, it depends. I attended a conference this summer about visitation, and I think that was the key takeaway, was like, we truly all do it differently. There are themes, but for us in particular, it really depends on the year. If it's a fall open house for an admitted student open house, of sort of our offerings. And sorry, I forgot what the second part of your question was.
Well, just whether the student has any sort of agency in selecting the schedule. Yeah, a la carte, or is it like everybody does the same thing?
Yes. I think in the fall, we really try to restrict students on what their options are. We want everybody to come in with a baseline, understanding the essays, understanding our holistic review process, and walking away from the institution knowing like, okay, I have a good sense of who Colorado College is, versus like an admitted student program or a spring open house. Students, we would hope, have some idea of what the college offers in terms of majors. They've already been admitted. And so that is really more of an a la carte of creating community Do you have questions about departments or housing or the career services, and letting them choose their own adventure? So I think it depends on the type of season they're looking to come visit.
And what would you say to the person that would say, hey, I'm a 10th grader, why can't I come? Or a parent, or I'm sure you've had that, or a parent who wants their 10th grader to come.
Yes. Like I mentioned earlier, just being intentional with our audience. I think I always start with your time will come, and we're totally open and willing to have a conversation with you over the phone or over Zoom. But we want to make sure that those students are getting full access and availability to our staff and our students because it's kind of crunch time for them, right? And so I think they're a little bit more understanding. They're coming from the mindset of just like, I have questions, I want them to be answered. And so when we open up that conversation, I think it's they're a little more understanding. But I get it, right? Like some students come in freshman year, sophomore year, and they're like, I know this is the college I want to go to. And we tell them that these open houses are here to stay. So your time will come junior year and senior year, and just being open and willing to have conversations earlier.
So Marissa, I know you know some other models that are out there. What are some different open house models at different schools that you've seen other than sort of the CC model?
Yeah. Well, I can speak to my prior institution at UCF and how we used to do it there. That was actually a 2-day open house event. And so students would come to campus and everyone would start with an information session. And then it was kind of choose your own adventure. They could go to athletics or housing or departments. And then they would do an overnight stay, but they also got to sample the dining halls on campus. There was always an event happening that they were welcome to attend. And then the following day was more focused on the admission aspect. So it's like, one, let's build a community. And then the second day, let's focus in on what their questions are about our application process. So I've seen it done that way. I think post-COVID, that's not as popular anymore, just given the safety concerns around housing and the spread of COVID-19. So I don't think those are as popular anymore. I think a lot of folks have shrunk down to just the one day. And again, like it could be a choose your own adventure. It could be a little bit more tapered down into like, this is what we want you to see during our day. So I think those are the differences I've seen. But I'll be honest with you, Mark, like over the past 3 years, a lot of folks have really tried to almost like become uniform in what we offer. Because I mean, as you'll see, right, we're different in application deadlines. We're different in how we read. And so when I was chatting with folks at CIVSA, the Conference for Visitation, it became very apparent that we should all get on the same page in terms of offerings and what students are being told about the admission process.
So I'm going to go back to kind of the data question, your data background.
Mm-hmm.
Putting my admission hat on, I would think that open houses are almost semi-yield events, kind of, in a sense of, like, I would think you'd want to get people there because the amount of time they can spend on the campus, the ability to sort of really understand the institution. Is that kind of the mindset in admissions? Like, let's try to get people 11th and 12th to the open house. And then I'm going to ask a double question. Do you have statistics on yield, like people that attend an open house versus other types of visits, whether you yield at a higher rate?
You might be onto something, Mark. Yes.
I used to be over visitations in boarding school.
You don't say.
And recruitment, yeah.
Yeah. So to answer the second part of your question, we definitely do have some yield modeling in terms of if students attend a fall open house versus admitted student open house versus a daily visit. When we used to offer overnights, that was actually one of the biggest predictors of whether a student would come or not, is if they stayed overnight.
Mm-hmm.
And now we see that really between a fall open house and admitted student open house, whether they come to one or the other, yield is going to be about the same. If they come to both, yield is definitely a lot higher.
Sure.
Versus just a general daily visit. So yes, like I do think that when it comes to reading applications and having those committee conversations, I know you have done a session on demonstrated interest. That's a piece of our
Sure.
pie, right?
Sure.
And seeing if students are actually genuinely interested in our institution. And we're very transparent about that. So yeah, we do use that throughout our whole admission cycle. Mm-hmm. And then the first part of your question, sorry, was?
Is there almost an attempt to steer people when they're saying, they're knowing that it's probably going to be correlated to yield, or a minimum, even if it's not just yield, just an understanding of who we are so that you can make an informed decision. And when you're in a situation, let's say you're on the road and someone's like, and let's say you're talking to a junior and they're thinking, you know what, I'm going to visit, do you find yourself saying, oh, we've got an open house coming up, like almost as a first choice to see if you can get them there as opposed to directing them to the daily visits?
I mean, selfishly, being in the role that I am, absolutely. Like me and the rest of my team have worked incredibly hard on these open houses. So of course we want a great turnout. And I think going back to my original, like bang for your buck, I think students get a lot more out of their visit when they come to an open house. But to be honest, when I do candidly chat with families, I tell them it's just important that you're coming to campus, right? Like whether you come for a daily visit or an open house, it's a personal decision. And we want you to know that we're just thankful you're carving out the time for us to come and get to know our community. So I don't want it to be like, oh, we have a preference if you come to open house and there's pressure to come to that. That's not the case at all. And I think we're just happy to host families to begin with. So, but yes, absolutely. If students are like, I'm thinking about coming, I'm like, well, you should think about open house, right? And especially if it's a couple months in advance, just because I think they'll get a lot more out of their visit.
Friends, this concludes the first part of my interview with Marissa Salizar, who's over all the visit programs at Colorado College. We hope you join us next week for part 2 of 5. Friends, no spotlight this week or until January. We're giving our staff a break during the holiday season. Friends, on Monday's episode, I am going to tackle the question that may be the worst question that I hate getting asked. And I think it's often been described by many admission officers as the most frequently asked question they get from students. And it's simply this: is it better to take the easier class and get an A or the harder class and get a B? I feel like every time I get that question, I get another gray hair. What makes it hard is it's extremely complex and really difficult to answer with any type of terse response or brevity. But I'm going to attempt to unlock the complexity of that question on Monday's episode. And then we have a brand new interview, which I'm really excited about. Linda will be hosting this interview, and it's with Derek Terrell. Now, Derek was a former Caltech admission officer, but the interview is not about Caltech. He's currently the Director of Engagement at the Coalition for College. And the Coalition for College has over 170 colleges that take their application. It's second only to the Common App. And we're going to be talking all things Coalition for College. It'll be a 2-parter. So we certainly hope that you'll join us next week for that. And friends, I've been closing out with these quotes on the personal statement. I've picked that because it is the one thing more than anything that a senior can start really, really late in the game and can have some impact on their application. You can't do that with, things like your transcript and your testing and activities and all those other things. So today I've got a quote from Matthew Boyce. Matthew was at George Mason when he shared this quote, but he is now enrollment at, we just call it UPS, but University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. So Matthew says this: I'm interested in who you are and why I should accept you as an admission counselor. What makes you interesting is really important aspect of your essay. See you on Monday, friends. And that's our show. A big thank you to you, our listeners, for tuning in this week. If you find this podcast helpful, please follow us and you'll get every single episode as soon as it is released. If you're interested, there are a few ways you can really support our podcast. You can click the share button and send it to your friends and acquaintances. You can help us pay our staff and our expenses by donating on our website. You can write a review for us on Apple or Spotify. I'm the producer of the podcast, but we have a fantastic team of 15. Shout out to our co-host, Dr. Lisa Ruff, Dr. David Williams, Linda Depker, Susan Tree, Vince Garcia, and Julia Esquivel. And to our substitute co-host, Sylvia Borgo. Our sensational sound engineer is Nemanja Motvich. Our amazing music is from Victor Allen Weeks. Marketing designs are from Kimberly Blass. Lily Parikh manages our Instagram. Our image editor is Talha Khan. Joy Stucker does our website episode updates. And our webmaster is Stylianos Dimitru. And if you want to have a coaching session with Lisa, Linda, or me, just text me at 404-664-4340. If you have a question you want us to answer, or if you have a recommended resource or article you think we should discuss, just send it to questions@yourcollegeboundkid.com. Our favorite method is for you to record your own voice at speakpipe.com/YCBK. By the way, check out our website, where you'll find lots of content that is not on any podcast app. Our website is yourcollegeboundkid.com. If you want to learn about other hot admissions topics, follow us on Twitter at YCBK Podcasts. We think of you as our listening family, and we look forward to meeting again with you every single Monday and Thursday.